Joining me now is John Bolton, former National Security Advisor to President Trump and U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. He, as you can imagine, has plenty to say about the current administration's efforts on the foreign policy front, from the competition with Russia and China to the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. Ambassador Bolton, it's a real pleasure to have you with us today. Look, we're bringing lots of different voices into this three-day festival, if you will, of ideas and people thinking about, how do we get the aspiration set as we look forward for a more perfect union for the United States of America and what we should be thinking about. And you've always been unapologetic in sort of talking about an agenda for the United States, its security and place in the world. And I would love to give our audience an understanding of, what is your dashboard? What do you think the biggest priorities are for this country right now that we have to get right as we look at our future?
Well, I think it's important over the long term not to have the U.S. focus on abstract ideological goals. I think you have to look at the concrete reality of protecting America and its people, their interests around the world, and to do that in the most effective way through alliances where possible and without them if necessary. And I think we have to recognize in the remainder of this century, we face a wide variety of challenges from the strategic level, most importantly, the question of China, but also Russia, and at the more immediate tactical level, the continuing threat of international terrorism, the continuing grave risk of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, especially in North Korea and Iran. And a host of other risks as well. I think the world has become more complicated in the post-Cold War period and in the post-Cold War period. And I think we can expect that for the rest of the century. There's no rest for the weary here when it comes to protecting American interests.
You have written that President Biden will be explaining why America is once again more vulnerable to terrorism after the departure from Afghanistan. You've also recently written that we should get rid of the Shanghai Communique, that we should reduce this obscurity and lack of clarity around Taiwan's status and rope it into a regional security arrangement, a genuine security arrangement with Japan, the United States, and other powers in the Indo-Pacific. I guess my question is, critics of your views on this would say John Bolton wants to do it all, that terrorism and over-responding to terrorism in the past helped us take the eye off the ball on China. My question to you is there any concern you have that we have to do a better job of establishing strategic priorities and that doing it all is tough, or are your critics right that John Bolton wants to do it all?
I think the United States can handle more than one strategic priority. In fact, I don't think it's not only possible we can do that, it's critical that we can. It's certainly the highest priority to focus on the threat of China. I consider it existential in this century, not just for the United States, but for the West as a whole. But that doesn't mean you can disregard other threats. And Afghanistan and the broader Middle East are excellent examples of that. As the Biden administration has withdrawn from Afghanistan and clearly trying to downplay the priority of the Middle East as a region, ostensibly to focus on China, China is increasing its efforts to extend its influence in precisely the region the Biden administration has turned away from. The world's a big and complex place. We are a big and capable country. And I don't think there's any lack of capacity for the United States to do that, where there has been over certainly the Obama, Trump, and now I think the Biden administration's a lack of leadership in both parties to explain to the American people that if they want to continue the kind of life, the kind of society we enjoy here, there has to be active involvement across the globe in order to protect the interest on which that society rests.
Thank you for that. Another thing that interests me is the president you served as National Security Advisor, President Trump, and with whom you have significant disagreements. Your book was a tour de force of some of those disagreements and laying out what you thought was the important course for the United States. But when you sort of look at this question, that President Trump really did flirt, in my view, with a kind of neo-isolationism, a kind of withdrawal, contracting from a lot of parts of the world, maybe not everything, but significantly. And if you read polls, a lot of Americans, particularly those that served in the military, do feel a fatigue, if you will, from a lot of America's engagement. They sort of felt like they fought the Cold War and China won. I'm just interested in how you turn that around. If there are huge numbers of Americans that are really ambivalent about American engagement and paying what needs to be paid for America to continue to be the security guarantor in the places, I'm just interested, you ran for president of the United States. What do we need to do, or what do you think we need to do to reconnect with Americans on why that task is so important to their bottom line?
Well, I think leadership has to believe that the posture American takes in the world is directly related to the strength of our economy and the viability of our society here. They really are two sides of the same coin. And yet, for far too long, we have not had presidents who have either understood the connection or been willing to make the case. Let's just take Afghanistan as an example. People relied on polls for years that said people want to get out of Afghanistan, end the endless wars. Not surprising when neither Obama nor Trump were defending the deployment of American forces in Afghanistan as an insurance policy. And yet, in the days when the American people watched a national humiliation on television, in the withdrawal from Afghanistan, their views became better informed. And polls now show that the American people think they are less secure after the withdrawal from Afghanistan than they were before. And they're absolutely right. This really cries out for political leaders who are willing to be straightforward with their voting public. And I think if you make the case effectively, the fatigue will fall away when people see that their way of life is under challenge, as I think it clearly is from China and the continuing threat of proliferation and terrorism. They're going to take steps necessary to protect themselves.
Let me ask you another question, because one of the themes we've been looking at is our digital future, digital promise, digital fragility, what are the threats out there? And as a preamble to this, I was recently in Estonia at the Leonard Meri conference. And this was a group of national security and intelligence officials from throughout Europe, but also the Balkans. And as we were doing this, the Russians were building about 200,000 troops for war game exercises just across the border. You had Belarus at the same time has weaponized migration and dropped a lot of people on the border of Lithuania. And you see what some players are doing in hybrid conflict, which is disinformation and digital destabilization, malware in financial systems and energy grids. And I just wonder how well America is positioned to deal with hybrid conflict. When we used to think about military issues like you and I have been discussing, you know what deterrence looks like, you know what credibility looks like. How does all this terminology work in the coming age of conflict, which is going to be hybrid and it's going to be digital? I just want to know what John Bolton's playbook is in that world.
Well, I think we have a long way to go to catch up with what some of our adversaries like China and Russia have done and already engaged in what, in my view, is an assault on the Constitution. I think that's what Russia's efforts to interfere in the 2016 election were. I think we've seen China engaged in influence operations digitally and otherwise that actually put the Russian effort in the shade. The Chinese effort is so large. So what's happening, and I think it's underway, is the American people have seen the scales fall from their eyes about information technology and the internet. It's not the Garden of Eden. It's just like the rest of the world. There's enormous good there, and there's enormous risk and danger there too. This is the cyberspace is a domain like every other human domain. It has its pluses and its minuses, and it can be peaceful, but it has. We're facing adversaries that have turned it into a domain of war in many respects, and we have to be ready for that. It requires education of the population. We're all learning. And as I say, I think we're behind at the moment, but I think we've become more aware, and I think we need the offensive and defensive capability that we're building now. We need to build it faster and bigger, but at least we've stopped we've change the view that everything's fine and we don't have anything to worry about. That's a major step forward.
Do you think, Ambassador, we are delivering costs to those perpetrators of things like the SolarWinds attack, of those weaponizing. I mean, those players in the hybrid warfare game where, you know, I sort of feel like sometimes the United States and its allies are sort of like the British that are well organized and standing out in the field. And some of these folks engaging in hybrid, they're like what, you know, we American revolutionaries used to be in the forest, fighting us in very untraditional ways. And we're like going, wait, they can't do that. Are we delivering cost to them for what they're doing?
Not adequately yet, but I do think, and I take some pride in this from my time in the Trump administration in 2018, where we changed the rules of engagement for offensive cyber warfare, and I think put the Russians on their heels in 2018. Now that's one skirmish in a long conflict. I think that, as I say, cyberspace is a domain like any other human domain, and deterrence works there as well as it does on any other battlefield. And I think our adversaries, and I think primarily of China and Russia, but also of North Korea and others, need to know that when they attack us, whether it's in the government space or the private sector, that they're going to pay costs that far exceed any damage they can inflict on us. And once that realization takes hold, once we have that capacity, hopefully deterrence will prevent them from engaging in those offensive activities to begin with.
Let me ask one last question. You write, and you mention French Ambassador Philippe Etienne, who was then National Security Advisor to President Macron, in your book several times, so you know him well. In the first time in French-American relations, our first ally, the French Ambassador to the United States was recalled after this move for the Australians, the British, and the United States to do a deal around the sale of nuclear submarines to Australia. And there's one thing, the substantive anger about that, because the French had the contract. The other side was how it was handled. And the French said they were lied to. They were stabbed in the back, even on Bastille Day, in an encounter between their Secretary of State and our Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. I just love that, you know decision making and you know stuff, how it rolls out. And maybe there's one issue about who should make those nuclear subs and what's involved. But the other issue is trust in a real vital relationship. Do you believe we sent the signal that France doesn't matter as much to us anymore?
Well, it's what happens when you put Republicans in charge of foreign policy. I mean, this is something that I'm quite surprised at, because the Biden campaign in 2020 was to restore competency in international affairs. And it just shows how hard it can be in difficult circumstances. I believe in the NATO alliance. I believe in our alliance with France. I don't think there was any diplomacy, frankly, that was going to overcome losing what has been reported as an $80 billion contract with the Australians. So there come a time when everybody has to pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and say, okay, let's get serious again. Hopefully that's what we're doing right now.
Well, John Bolton, former United Nations ambassador, also former National Security Advisor to the United States, and author of The Room Where It Happened. Great book. It's a great tutorial on national security decision-making during the Trump era and before. I mean, it's a great history of many things that Ambassador Bolton has been involved with. Thanks so much for joining us today on this forum, A More Perfect Union. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much for having me.